Hello and welcome to our fifth Psychosocial Wednesday webinar this year. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to thank the IAMP for supporting this initiative in 2023 and the Instituto Freedom in Brazil for producing this event. And finally, I want to remind you that our next guest on June 14th will be Katrin Fleischmann. Our guest speaker today is Niccolo Fiorentino Polipo, one of the most promising new neo-Jungian voices we have. He's a clinical psychologist at the Psychological Science Research Institute of the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. He holds a bachelor degree in philosophy, a second cycle degree in clinical psychology, and a master's in forensic psychology. So he has a lot of degrees. He's training as a Jungian analyst. And one of his main research interests is the relation between Jungian psychology and ethics, normative ethics it is. He is the author of Vulnerability and Incorruptibility, an archaic model of the transcendent function. And in the Jungian perspective published in the Jungian perspective on indeterminate states, betwixt and between borders. His talk today, False Start, a neo-Jungian critique of self-help, has been published in Stefano Carpani's book, Individuation and Liberty in a Globalized World, which has been published last year by Routledge. Niccolo, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak at this great initiative. Thank you also to the Institute of Freedom for making this possible. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Well, not starting from the conclusions. Okay. So as Bernard said, I'm going to present a chapter that appeared in a book edited by Stefano Carpani last year that is entitled False Start, and it's a new Jungian critique of self-help. So I'd like to start by saying a few words about why I think that self-help is a topic that we should think about, and especially with a critical mind, let's say. And this has to do with what I call the secularization of ethical systems. So I use the term ethical system in a very general way to mean any kind of, any source of orientation that people might turn to whenever they are lost or confused, and that they may draw from to get insights about what to do with their lives or what kind of person to be. And by secularization, I mean a historical trend that was noticed by several authors, including, for instance, Browning and Cooper in this book, but that was noticed also by Jung, among others. And that's the trend by which, if for the longest period in history, religion was sort of the main ethical system, so that a disoriented individual would turn almost automatically, if they were in a state of psychological distress, to a religious figure such as a priest or a rabbi, as a transformation took place in the course of the last century, whereby psychotherapeutic psychologies started to function themselves as ethical systems, and people in a state of confusion, distress, disorientation, they would start to turn to therapists, analysts, doctors, again, to seek orientation. But then this trend continues nowadays in ways that perhaps Jung could not have imagined. And I would argue that today, a disoriented individual is the easiest and therefore the commonest thing that they might do, actually, even before committing to a psychotherapeutic process, is to turn to self-help. So they might go to a bookstore and buy a book about how to get their lives together, or they might turn on social media and so on. And so that's why, since we are talking about millions of people who are now seeking their orientation in this way, then we need to seriously ask the question about whether self-help can provide satisfactory answer to these needs for orientation. But we need to also clarify what we mean by self-help. When we use this term, normally we think about these books for the personal development of the individual, but I would like to problematize this notion by noticing that self-help is not just a publishing industry. On the one hand, because it is not just about books, but you have all kinds of products, you have workshops, retreats, social media accounts, and so on. And then on the other hand, because it is not just about business, but when we speak of the so-called motivational culture, these quotes that people post on social media, these are things that people believe in and they use to orient their life. It's a whole view on how happiness is to be attained. So it functions as an ethical system, as I said. And in that sense, we might qualify self-help as a cultural complex that we find in most relatively affluent societies, not only Western ones, but also, for instance, Chinese society. And given the complexity of the phenomenon, I, in the chapter, gave my own tentative definition of what we could mean by self-help. And I used this notion of project, which I take from existential philosophy. And from an existential point of view, we have projects. So a romantic relationship or a career are projects that we have. But then in a more radical sense, we are a project ourselves. And so I talk of self-help project as any kind of attempt that we can make to change ourselves, so at self-change, that is guided by a specific kind of proposition, which I formalize as, let us strive for P and leave non-P behind, where P can be any kind of desideratum, so something that we would like to see in our lives or in the world, of an ethical psychological nature, and non-P is its opposite, or all that is standing in the way of us attaining that desideratum. And so this is a formal definition that covers things that we would intuitively call self-help, but also other things. For instance, your classic New Year's resolution would qualify as a self-help project insofar as it could sound something like, let us strive for fitness and leave all this laziness behind. And I'm going to start from a basic assumption, and that is that self-help projects, on average, they do not seem to work. And the problem is not so much that they do not start, if we think, for instance, about New Year's resolutions, but they do not last very long in time. We often go back to our habits. And this is an assumption that I'm not going to prove. I'm just really going to assume it, because for me, it is not sufficient then to criticize self-help projects just on this ground. So just by saying that they do not work, we need a psychological explanation for why they do not work and why perhaps they could not possibly work. And if we turn to common sense or folk psychology, people often explain this phenomenon by saying that human beings are weak-willed, so they don't have enough willpower. But I'm going to propose an alternative explanation that is based on Jung's theory of psychodynamics that is counterintuitive, and that tells us that these projects might actually be doomed to fail regardless of how much willpower we pour into them. And so I draw from Jung's theory of psychodynamics, which I see as including his theory of libido and his theory of symbol. So let's start with the theory of libido. So it is widely known that, unlike Freud, Jung did not think of libido in prevalently sexual terms, but as psychic energy in the widest sense. So everything that has to do with, let's say, life force, desire, aspiration. And Jung makes a lot of analogies between how psychic energy works and how physical energy works. And so we can reconstruct his theory of libido by isolating two fundamental ideas. The first one is that consciousness depends on libido for all of its activities. And here the analogy is that consciousness is a bit like a machine that needs to be supplied with energy in order to perform any kind of work. But then, on the other hand, the other idea that we find in Jung is that consciousness does not dispose of this energetic source of libido as it pleases, but there are certain constraints. Again, in analogy with physical energy, Jung says that there is a need for favorable gradients, or he also says that libido is a bit like water and it needs a slope to flow. And if we take these two ideas together, they present us with a specific problem, because if consciousness depends on libido, but libido lies outside of its reach, which means it lies in the unconscious, then what happens if, for whatever reason, consciousness finds itself unable to provide that gradient which is needed for libido to outflow and be channeled into its projects? So in that case, we have what I call an energetic misalignment between consciousness and its energetic source. And this misalignment can take one of two forms. The first one is the subtraction of libido. So that's when consciousness fails to provide a gradient, and therefore libido simply does not flow. It's like a drought, or like a sink that we open and water is not coming out. And this translates subjectively into the experience of a sort of loss of momentum. Jung says life ceases to flow, things lose their meaning, and in modern terms, we would say that we feel stuck, we feel depressed, burnt out, and so on. But then there is the opposite scenario, that is the autonomization of libido. And that's the case when consciousness fails to provide the favorable gradient, and therefore libido, after accumulating and reaching a certain threshold, then it just runs uncontrolled autonomously. And here the experience is different, is that the subject feels at the mercy of an implacable force, which due to its autonomous force is typically felt as extraneous and therefore projected outside. And it is important to understand that if libido, just like hydropower, is in itself morally neutral, says Jung, at the same time, the energetic misalignment is a very practical problem, and therefore also a moral problem, and in particular a problem of diminished moral agency, so the possibility to self-determine. Because, as we said, all action requires libido. That includes moral action. And so what could happen is that in the case of the subtraction of libido, someone's good actions, let's say, would suffer this reflux of libido. Or in the case of the autonomization of libido, someone might be coerced into doing the evil that they do not want. So although libido in itself is neither good nor evil, we still need it to do good and to avoid evil, because, as Jung says, there is no morality without freedom. So it is true, as Seneca famously put it, and as it is often quoted on self-help social media accounts, that there is no favorable wind for the sailor who doesn't know where to go. And that's fair enough. But at the same time, I could know where I want to go. So I could have an orientation, a project, and the will to pursue it. But that might still not be sufficient, because I could have that, but still I could be becalmed, which means that there is no wind. So let's say that I am out in the sea and I want to go north. I have no wind leading me north, and that's the subtraction of libido. Or I could have the wind blowing in the opposite direction. So I want to go north and the wind is blowing south, and that's the autonomization of libido. So besides an orientation, what we actually need is to find a way to gain the collaboration of the wind, which means of the unconscious, of libido, of the forces of nature. And to do that, I propose that besides a compass that tells us where the north is, we actually also need another instrument that resembles the bag of winds that Aeolus, the god of winds, in the Odyssey gives to Ulysses. And this is a magical object because, so it is a bag of winds that contains all of the winds that are chaotically going in every direction. It keeps them inside the bag, so it keeps them at bay, but it leaves outside of the bag the one and only wind that is favorable to the sailor's course. And so this magical object solves the problem of the energetic misalignment in both of its forms. It solves the subtraction because it leaves outside at least the wind that we need to go forward, but it solves the autonomization because it keeps all of the other contrary winds inside the bag. And so the question becomes, where do we get such a magical object that we so much need? And this instrument is the symbol. So this is the connection that I see and that I make between Jung's theory of libido and his theory of symbol, because that's exactly the way in which Jung thinks about the symbol. Again, in analogy with physical energy, he also compares the symbol to a transformer that is used to convert libido from a lower form, so a form in which libido is in the unconscious and therefore unavailable, to a higher form, so a form that is available to consciousness, or a usable form. But that besides the metaphor, so the transformer and the bag of winds, if we were to give a definition of a symbol, it would be an expression with an indicative nature. So it's simply a representation hinting at something beyond itself. And Jung makes this distinction between a sign that is an expression of something that we know. So it's just basically an abbreviation of that other thing that we know, and a proper symbol that is an expression of something else, but that something else, we partly know it and we partly do not know it. And so a symbol brings together the known and the unknown, but then more generally, it brings together all of the opposites in the psyche. Jung says it is neither abstract nor concrete, neither rational, irrational, real, unreal, but it is always both. It also, a symbol speaks to our intellect, but then it speaks also to our other psychic functions, feeling, intuition, sensation. And most generally, a symbol unites antithetical elements in its nature. So we could say that a symbol is a unified representation of the totality of the psyche in all of its different incommensurable aspects. And only then, so only when it is such a representation with these characteristics, then it is suitable to provide that gradient which is needed for libido to outflow. So in other words, in order to be effective, a symbol must express at each moment the inexpressible, and it must be unassailable, which means that it must resist all of the attempts by our intellect or our reason to break it down, to understand it, and therefore reduce it to a sign. And as long as this is the case, then Jung calls it a living symbol. But as soon as it loses this quality, so it is reduced to a sign, then it also loses its life-promoting value. And it is just something that we used to not know, and now we fully know. So then the key question becomes, how is a symbol formed? How do we get this much needed representation? And Jung is very clear on this. He says that such an expression cannot be contrived by reason, which means it cannot be invented. I cannot sit at a table and invent a symbol. It can only be created through living, which means it has to emerge from the unconscious. And this makes sense in light of what we just said, because if the symbol has to be this synthesis of opposites, of the conscious and the unconscious, then it makes sense that consciousness cannot create one for itself, because whenever consciousness creates something, it can only put into it what it already knows and not also the unknown. But then also, because consciousness typically works, according to Jung, by the non-contradiction principle. It tends to think in such a way that is either one thing or its opposite, and that there is no third way. And so we come to this bitter conclusion that a symbol always has to emerge from the unconscious. And this conclusion is bitter, of course, from the point of view of consciousness. It is bad news for consciousness, because this means that consciousness is twice subjected to the unconscious. On the one hand, because from the unconscious comes the problem that consciousness faces, which I have named the energetic misalignment. But then also because from the unconscious comes also the only solution that Jung sees to that problem, which is the symbol. And that's why I put this image of the Baron Munchausen, or Munchausen, I never know how to pronounce this, but that is a fantastic adventurer who in one of the stories falls into a pond or something like that, and manages to get out of this difficult situation by pulling its own hair, which is obviously impossible. And it is impossible because we would say it violates the law of gravity. But for Jung, the same degree of impossibility has to be predicated on the idea that consciousness would be able to solve its own energetic predicament. It's just as impossible. And so in light of Jung's theory of psychodynamics, libido and symbol, we conclude that one places unrealistic faith in willpower if one believes that it can generate any lasting, meaningful change in the absence of a living symbol. As Jung says, psychic development cannot be accomplished by intention and will alone. It needs the power of the symbol. Or the voluntaristic decision, so the decision based on will alone, is an ineffectual solution to the ethical problem, because there is also a need for the symbol in addition to that. And so that we can circle back to the idea that also any project, any attempt at self-change that is accompanied by will alone and not by a living symbol is also doomed to fail. And so now, building on Jung's theory of psychodynamics, I propose a theoretical framework that formalizes or systematizes all of this, and in particular that is intended to be used to classify ethical systems on the basis of their likelihood of leading to lasting change. And this framework rests on a basic assumption that to many of you will sound reasonable, to some of you may not, but the assumption is that there are some natural laws governing human life that one needs to become acquainted with and abide by as much as possible if one wants to lead a good life, or we could say a happy life or a flourished life, whatever the definition is of a good life. And this assumption is part of a form of ethical realism, by which these laws are seen as existing out there, regardless of our belief in their existence, just like the law of gravity doesn't need us to believe in it for it to exist and for us to be subject to it. And this assumption is not universally shared in ethics. So there are some ethics that do not share this assumption, but it is still widely held. We find it in all traditional systems of ethics, and in particular, so-called natural law ethical systems. So we find it in the Greek Aristotle, in Christian ethics as systematized by Thomas Aquinas. We find it in non-Western ethics, so in Taoism and so on. We also find it in Jung, who believed that there is nothing arbitrary about morality, but that morality follows or is inherent in the laws of life. So reaching the optimum of life makes morality what it is. And then we find it also in self-help. So these books, for instance, are typically based on the idea that there are some rules that one has to follow in order to be happy. And for brevity, in this framework, I am going to hypostatize the whole set of natural laws that we assume to exist and to govern human life, just by calling it the truth hole for brevity. And if we look at traditional systems of ethics, the truth hole is typically believed to have two properties. One is that it is believed to be eternal, which means that it transcends most changes in history or in culture. Just like the law of gravity is the same here in Milan as wherever you are listening this from. And it is the same today as it was thousands of years ago, the same is assumed to be true about these natural laws. And then the other property is that it is assumed to be complex, which means that it transcends our ability to understand it fully, to penetrate it with our intellect. And this is so also because the truth whole fails to comply with that principle of non-contradiction that we said characterizes the mode of thinking of consciousness. The truth whole contains contradictions. And this is an idea that we find, for instance, in Hegel, when he says that the truth is the whole. What he means is that truth is that which embraces the single dialectical oppositions, the single moments that oppose each other. And we find it also in Jung when he says that if something is psychologically true, then its opposite must be true as well. Here too, he is linking truth to wholeness in the sense of containment of opposites. And this co-presence of opposites is traditionally imagined by giving the truth whole a circular or a spherical form. But then moving downwards in this framework from the truth whole, we find what I call level 1 ethical systems, or L1 ethical systems. And these are ethical systems that attempt to express the truthful, but they do so necessarily in an imperfect way because of the complex nature of the truthful. And we find this idea, for instance, in Taoism, when we read in the Tao Te Ching that the Tao that we can speak about is not the eternal Tao. So it's not the truthful, it's just an image that we form of it. And in that sense, L1 is this level is a level of representation. What we find here are some maps of the truthful as opposed to the truthful itself. And this is the level where what Jung calls living symbols belong. Because as we said, living symbols are representations of the psyche. They are not the actual psyche. They're representations of the psyche in all of its different incommensurable aspects. And here too, I draw from the classics to illustrate this with an image that's Achilles' shield. So there is this passage in the Iliad that is quite strange because Homerus starts describing Achilles' shield, but he goes on and on for pages and pages, describing all that has been carved on Achilles' shield. And he describes that there are scenes of war, scenes of agriculture, scenes of dance and celebration. And so commentators have interpreted this by saying that it is as if on the shield, the whole of life was represented. So as if the shield was a microcosm in which the whole macrocosm can reflect. And that's exactly what a living symbol for Jung is. It's a finite representation, but in which the truth whole has to be represented. And what is interesting also is that in the Iliad, this shield was made by no mortal. It was made by a god, Hephaestus, just like the bag of winds was the gift of a god, which resonates with Jung's idea that living symbols cannot be made by consciousness. They can only emerge from the unconscious. And by staying close enough to the truthful, this L1 ethical systems, they participate in some of its properties. So if we said that the truthful is eternal, then these systems, they are not eternal, but they are long-lasting at least. And if the truthful is complex, then these systems also partly elude us. And there is a proportional relationship such that the more these systems, they resemble the well-roundedness of the truthful, which we have interpreted as its containment of opposites and contradictions, then the more they are long-lasting. And I try to represent this by showing that, however, L1 systems will always be a little squashed compared to the perfect well-roundedness of the truthful. And the classic example of a living symbol that Jung uses is the Christian symbol. The cross or Jesus on the cross is a map of the truthful, is a finite representation, a minimalistic representation, but that expresses so many contradictions of human life, of the truthful. It expresses death and eternal life, the human and divine nature of Jesus, and so on. And if we look at history, two properties cannot be denied to the Christian symbol. One is its great motivating or activating power, if we think about martyrdom and even the negative side of history, so the Crusades. And then the other property is the longevity, having imposed itself for thousands of years as a source of orientation. And what is interesting here too is that the longevity of the Christian symbol is often put by believers, by Christians, in relationship to its non-human origin. So believers will say, well, if the symbol has imposed itself for thousands of years, has lasted so long, then this is proof that it could not have been the words of a man. It must have been the words of a God, And this, again, if we translate it back into Jung's theory of psychodynamics, makes sense, because it says, if it is a living symbol, then it could not have been made by consciousness. It must have come from elsewhere, which means from the unconscious. And and this idea we also find in the Bible, in other passages, with the, for instance, when it is said that all that man does perishes, but all that God does lasts. But so long-lasting as they are, these systems, they are not eternal because they are not the truth whole. And so as consciousness evolves, these symbols, living symbols, tend to die, while the truth whole will survive them. And that is why Jung could say about the Christian symbol, I know it is the truth, but it is the truth in a form in which I cannot accept it anymore. So I know it is the truth whole, but it is in a map or in a representation that I have outlived because I have seen through it. And the same applies for not collective, but individual symbols. They also have this function of bringing us forward, but then they tend to be outlived and then left behind. And then descending further down, we find what I call level 2 ethical systems. So these are systems that are entirely made by mortals, which means they are entirely consciousness-based. And if L1 systems were already kind of a betrayal of the truthful, L2 systems, we could say with Plato, that they are twice removed from the truthful. And because not only they are representations of the truthful, but they are representations that are tainted by the one-sidedness of consciousness, so the non-contradiction principle. And the example that I take from Jung is Schiller's aestheticism. In the psychological types, Jung criticizes Schiller's aestheticism, saying that it is too differentiated on a rational level, so it is one-sided. And he says it is therefore not fitted to solve the ethical problem because it simply poses a value, in that case, beauty and pleasure, while rejecting everything contrary to it, anything evil, ugly, and difficult. But Jung continues and he says, but since life itself, so the truthful, streams from sources that are clear and muddy, then this kind of ethical systems, they pay a penalty, which is that they lose their moral force. And precisely because the muddy elements are excluded. So because non-P has been excluded. And so we can now recognize the propositions guiding self-help projects as L2 systems according to this framework. They also function in the same logic that Jung criticizes, that we could summarize as taking the best from the truthful and leaving what one does not want behind. And so if we follow Jung, then we come to the paradoxical conclusion that the so-called motivational culture would actually have no motivating power at all, because as he says, the systems have no moral force. But this could also help us to understand why these systems tend to give rise to projects that are short-lived, because they are furthest away from the eternal truthful. So we have eternal, and then long-lasting, and then short-lived at the bottom. And this is the context in which I propose the concept of full start. So this is just a way to name and to summarize all of this framework, and naming the psychodynamic pattern that seems to be triggered by L2 ethical systems. And it is a psychodynamic pattern that seems to occur in two phases. So in the first one, you have consciousness orienting itself towards what I call a pseudo-symbolic proposition. And that's an indicative expression, but that falls short of the requirements to be an actual living symbol. And that's the proposition that we saw before: let us strive for P and leave non-P behind. And this allows a momentary release of libido, but at the same time, it lays the ground for an inflation, which is the psychic event by which a part, so P, identifies itself with the whole, preluding to transformation with a catastrophic character. And that's what we see in the second phase. That's when the puffed up or inflated conscious attitude is taken down by non-P. So by exactly whatever negative the pseudo-symbolic proposition wanted to liberate the subject from. And this is enantiodromia as we know it, as the emergence of the unconscious opposite in the course of time. But what is interesting is that this is a return of that same loss of moral agency that the subject wanted to avoid. So that diminished moral agency. And because as Kolachiki says, inflation may provide a sense of temporary joy, but it undermines moral freedom. And this two-step pattern actually, if we zoom out, is normative in Jung's model of psychic development, and so also in his theory of individuation. If we think, for instance, about his theorization of the passage from the first to the second half of life, there too you kind of have an inflation being followed by a deflation. But what is peculiar about false starts is the rapidity. And that's why I insist on the idea that it's an accelerated psychodynamic pattern, because in principle, there are two ways to block the dialectical development of the personality. One is to shut it down, and that's the criticism that Stefano Carpani in the book, in his chapter in the book, makes of certain forms of mindfulness, which would somehow numb something that should actually develop and in order to give rise to a dialectical synthesis. But then the opposite way is to speed up the process to excess. And the metaphor that I use is with music. So in music, in a symphony, typically you have a musical theme that is developed and we get familiar with it. And then at certain point, there will emerge a counter theme. And in the end, they will both meaningfully resolve into something else. But for that to be possible, you need time. You need to allow the theme to develop itself. And only then the opposition and then the resolution will be meaningful. If, on the other hand, you have a few notes and then immediately thereafter you have a counter theme, what you have is a cacophony. You don't have music. Music is made impossible if it is accelerated in this sense. And something similar is true about psychic development. Individuation is made impossible by false starts. And I'll use one example from a very famous self-help book, To Stop Smoking. And the slogan of this book is that it is easy to quit smoking if you know how to do it. And as you read through the book, the author talks about all the drawbacks of being a smoker. You lose money, you lose your health, and so on. And then you arrive at this chapter that is entitled The Advantages of Being a Smoker. And here the author has left a blank page, which is kind of a joke, to mean there are no advantages to being a smoker. And so one is supposed to just pass to the next chapter. But I think that this blank page is a very good illustration of the concealment of the negative that is made by pseudo-symbolic propositions. Because as Freud tells us, there are no symptomatic behaviors, let's say, without secondary gains. It's not true that there are no advantages to being a smoker. It can help me to kill time, to fit in, to ask the lighter to a girl that I fancy at a bar, and so on. And so indeed, it is easy to stop smoking if I am presented with a one-sidedly positive picture of change. But with this pseudo-symbolic proposition, the trajectory of a false start is already laid down, because what could happen is that I get motivated enough to stop smoking, because after all, I am told I have nothing to lose, I have no advantages. But then in life, I am bound to meet those secondary gains, which actually do exist. And then I may fall under the influence of the secondary gains, and I may be naively surprised just at how easy it was to fall under the spell of something that I was told didn't exist. And so that's another metaphor from the classics, but it's a bit like when Polyphemus, the Cyclop, gets tricked by Ulysses. So Ulysses and his companions, they blind the Cyclop, but Ulysses had given him a false name. He had said that his name was Nobody or No One. And so when the Cyclop asks to be revenged to his brothers, he says, nobody failed me, nobody blinded me. And then the brother says, then why do you complain? And so similarly, the moral subject was failed by nothing, by that which did not appear on the blank page. And so in this sense, as Dreuermann says about other kinds of ethical systems, but that holds true as well, these oversimplifications, they do not bring, as we may think, a greater sense of humanity and universal happiness, but they bring a particular form of cruelty and dishonesty, because then the reader will, just like Polyphemus, will have nobody to blame but themselves. And yet, what doesn't appear is that the teacher might be in error, so the ethical system, and not the pupil, the disoriented individual. Because in reality, there might be nothing spiritually easy about stopping to smoke, unless we mean it as in the joke attributed to Twain that says, it's the easiest thing in the world. I've done it 1,000 times. And that's 1,000 false starts. I think I'm going to skip this. This is an analogy that I make in the chapter between life projects and the psychodynamics and of life projects, and then planes and how actual planes can fly, so the aerodynamics. But I think that we can skip this. I know that we are short on time. And maybe I'll just give a couple of examples from popular culture. One is the movie Yes Man with Jim Carrey. I don't know if some of you watched it. It's the story of a man who is depressed. I think he comes out of a divorce, and he always says no to life. Whenever his friends ask him to go out, to have a beer, he always says no, just lies on his couch, and his life is in shambles. And then one day, one of his friends forces him to go to a self-help seminar where there is this guru who proposes a very simple rule, and that's that we should always say yes to whatever. So if a friend invites us out, we should say yes. Even if a homeless person asks us for money, we should say yes. It's as simple as that. And Jim Carrey tries this rule, and actually it works. So by saying yes, he finds love, Zoe Deschanel. He has all kinds of adventures. He learns to play the guitar. He has existential fireworks in his life. But this is then followed by the fact that by sticking to the rule, by keep using the rule, then he loses the love that he found. One of his friends ends up being fired, and he actually, the movie ends with him in a hospital bed. So that we see this shooting star parabola that is exactly the anatomy of a false start. And what did not appear in the proposition that guided the project is non-P, so the no's that sometimes we have to say in life, and that we have to balance with the yeses, let's say. And yeah, that's an example. And another one is from The Office. So there is this episode where Michael Scott, the manager of a local paper company, is at a christening, I think, and he realizes that his life is very boring, that he has no friends, and that he only has work basically in his life. And he gets out of the building and he sees a bus with some young people who are leaving for Mexico to do some volunteering. And he decides to join, to jump on the bus and to go to Mexico with them. And he's enthusiastic about this, that will change his life around. And his colleagues from down the bus, they try to talk him out of it. They says, what are you doing? You have a job here. You don't even have a luggage. What are you going to do in Mexico? But he just will not have it. But then what is comical is that just 5 minutes later, all of those reasons that non-P emerges from within. So he starts to think, actually, what am I going to do in Mexico? I don't even have a toothbrush. And then he begs the bus driver to let him down just a few kilometers down. And so here too, we see the anatomy of a false start with this concealment of the negative that just returns shortly thereafter. And I've said a lot of negative things, let's say, about false starts, but I'd like to say something in defense of false starts, because I started from the idea of this historical trend, which means that we find ourselves in a particular, special historical period. And Jung describes this period by saying that due to the crisis of religion as ethical systems, we find ourselves in a situation where we should admit our spiritual poverty, our symbollessness. So we do not have, as other people may have had in the past, those ethical systems to sustain us. And that is why we may be particularly drawn now to false starts. But that's also why we should not be moralistic about false starts, because we said that a living symbol has to emerge from the unconscious. But what are we going to do in the wait for a living symbol? As we wait for this to happen, how is ethical life going to proceed? And the idea that we should just embrace what I call here naked life, so a life sober of libido, is too much for most to bear. I link this to the monologue that Sonia makes at the end of Uncle Vanya, that is very depressing. And she says, what can we do? We shall live all through the endless procession of days ahead of us, and through the long evenings. We shall bear patiently the burdens that fate imposes on us. This kind of prospect is too much for most to bear. And that's why, as the poet says, as Baudelaire says, we all need to be drunk on something. We need our fix of libido, as it were. But the only problem is that by then embracing false starts, we embrace a substitute for that same suffering that Sonia proposes us, and we end up suffering all the same, but just in a more frantic way, just like Michael Scott or Jim Carrey in the examples. I come to the conclusions, and so I have argued that self-help does not provide a satisfactory answer to the ethical needs of modern individuals, and that is because these projects are guided by pseudo-symbolic propositions that function as level 2 ethical systems. And these systems, they may allow a momentary release of libido, but at the same time, they trigger this accelerated psychodynamic pattern that I call a false start. And what I think is particularly useful about a new Jungian perspective is that we can tell a priori in advance what projects are going to last just by looking at the shape of the proposition that guides them. Just like we can say if something will fly or not by also looking at its shape. If it's a cube, it will not fly. And so in that sense, Jung's psychodynamics can help us to rethink the constraints that exist on omnipotent self-plasmation, especially in a time when we tend to think that we can be whoever we want and fashion ourselves limitlessly. And this may have a liberating effect, because we might discover that the failure of this project is not to be blamed on our weak will, but on some necessary laws, some psychodynamic laws. And I conclude with a couple of citations that are some of my favorite. One is from Spinoza, 17th century, but I think it really speaks still to us today. This is his ethics, and he is complaining about other people who before him have written about ethics. And he says, these people, they give the impression that they are discussing things that are outside of nature, rather than natural things that follow the common laws of nature. In fact, they seem to conceive of man in nature as a kingdom within a kingdom. This is because they believe that human beings disrupt rather than follow the order of nature, and that they have absolute power over their actions and are wholly self-determining. They then attribute the cause of the powerlessness and inconstancy of human beings, not to the common power of nature, but to some sort of fault in human nature. And I think we could say really the same thing about self-help authors today. They also sometimes think about human beings as a kingdom within a kingdom, as if we had absolute power and were wholly self-determining. And then the final one that also ante litteram describes what I've been trying to present to you is a quote by Dostoevsky from the notes from the underground. And he says, I have a friend. He's a friend of yours too. And in fact, to whom is he not a friend? When he undertakes to do something, this gentleman will immediately expound to you lucidly and grandiloquently exactly how he should proceed. And then exactly a quarter of an hour later, prompted by some inner impulse which is stronger than all his interests, he'll take a completely different track. That is to say, he'll blatantly go against what he was just saying. I'm warning you that my friend is a collective person, so it's rather difficult to pin the blame on him individually. And here too we find everything. We find the inflation, so the grandiloquently. We find the accelerated pattern a quarter of an hour later. We find the psychodynamics, the inner impulse. But then the last sentence is, I think, very powerful, because it says, in this friend, we could recognize an actual friend that we have, and that we could blame for being weak-willed or hypocritical. But then he says, but this friend is a collective person. That's how all of us we are. That's how human nature is. And so you should not pin the blame on him, but on this psychodynamic laws, this inner impulses, let's say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Niccolo. That was a very inspiring talk. Yeah, what shall I say? One comment, I think there were a couple of questions about the slides. People want to have them. And then I have a couple of questions myself. A note to other people, if you have questions, please raise your hand electronically, yes, virtually. You will be unmuted and then can present your question. Maybe I start with one, or with two actually. Is the symbol the way to overcome the tertium non datur?
In what sense to overcome?
Sorry?
In what sense to overcome?
To integrate it, to come to something new.
Yeah, I would say so. I think there is a very close relationship between the symbol and what Jung calls the transcendent function, which is pointing towards this third. And that's what I think we cannot produce ourselves, precisely the third. We oscillate, I think, between the opposites and are rather a victim of the opposites, as if torn between them. And it is always the third that eludes us. It's like a blind spot, like the point that we don't see. And that's why from there, Jung says, can come then the way forward, but it cannot be imagined beforehand. And that's, I think, there lies the whole problem. But yeah, I would say then this tertium, the transcendent function, is very much linked with what the symbol is for.
You may know there is the Buddhist logic of the tetralemma by Nagarjuna, which is explicitly trying to integrate opposites and come to a new thing. Tetra means four, and there's even the negated tetralemma, so you have 5 stages. So it's a way to, it's a logical, processual way to do what you said.
I didn't know. I'll check it out. Seems very interesting.
Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna. I think the first one was Betty Sue Flowers with her question.
Maybe I should ask you, Bernard, about this question, but Niccolo, if you were writing a self-help book from this perspective, what might be the outline of it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I have to say this, that again, my talk is in general. I make a lot of generalizations. I talk on average. For instance, when I say self-help does not seem to work, that's on average, because I know of people who have read self-help books and have had lasting change. So exceptions are possible, and even in moral philosophy, for instance, in Christian moral philosophy, we talk about the grace, and that's when the laws are suspended. So my discourse is on average. That's the first point that I wanted to make. So I do not condemn at all the self-help books. I find that there are some excellent self-help books from a Jungian and a non-Jungian perspective. And ironically, myself, I became first interested in Jungian psychology when I was 17 through a self-help book that is by post-Jungian, that is called Aldo Carotenuto, who wrote extensively to popularize Jungian ideas in a way that I thought was very intelligent. And there was this book that actually was, so I read it at 17, but it's about third age and getting old. And it's called Going Through Life, Attraversare la Vita. I don't think it has been translated in English, but it's an excellent book. So myself, I don't think I am all in favor of popularization of Jungian ideas. So the idea of giving psychoanalysis away, or in the sense of giving it to the wide audience. I'm a big admirer, for instance, of Erich Neumann and his project of the new ethic, which was trying to do this, even though there are certain problems with that project. But the idea to speak to a large audience about the way to do that, I would have to think. I would have to think seriously, and but I think the advantage of reasoning about these things is that then we can monitor ourselves. We can ask ourselves, what I'm proposing, is it actually just saying, let's go towards P and leave non-P behind? Is it just reproducing the same logic which elsewhere I found to be ineffective? And then one can try to make it more complex, make it more well-rounded, let's say. But yeah, I have no book in store for the moment.
Well, just as a follow-up, I have a project for you then. Write one of your P non-P things about dieting. You would make $1 million, and then you can hire a team of translators to translate this book, the Going Through Life book, for the rest of us who would really like to read it.
My mother does dieting, so we can also bring her in.
Okay, Dennis?
Oh, I so enjoyed your talk. There were just so many thoughts that came up. I think as Jungians, we are kind of bundled in with the New Age group. And what I've seen mostly the problem there is just the lack of the shadow. And two things I like to say. I think of a woman I worked with years ago, very successful in her field, also very involved with a kind of New Age group and a big meditator. And she had a dream that she was meditating on a cloud, and then some dark male figure appeared at the edge of the cloud. So her response in the dream was to meditate even harder. So needless to say, we had a lot of work to do with her shadow side and the animus. But with regard to what Bernard was saying before about the symbolism, I think very much of Maria Prophetessa. Out of the one comes the two, out of the two comes the three, and out of the three comes the one as the four. So if you say the three position is the recognition of your complex and the enantiodromia going from one side to another, just the painful recognition, and to be crucified, this is where I see Jesus on the cross, by that, and is hopeless. And that's when you go back to the one position, that wholeness and a symbol is produced that can take care of the dichotomies and lead you beyond it. But just so much stuff. And I've done a lot of talking about the I Ching and the Tao, and I'm going to really work with your diagram there about those different levels. But the Hermes I presented as the first thing out of what the Tao points to, and that's the yin yang symbol. It's a symbol.
Thank you very much. I think the dream that you brought says a lot about this. It makes me think of what I was saying before, citing Stefano, about the risk that sometimes meditation is a way to numb the, well, it in principle is antithetical to the idea of active imagination, which is instead this confrontation with the figures. But I think it's a very nice clinical example, illustration.
Otto?
What is the reference to Jung and Neumann 2015? Is that a book, a new book out?
That's the correspondence between them that came out with the title, I think it's Analytical Psychology in Exile.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm quite fascinated by the new ethic and writing about it myself right now. So it's nice to know I'm not alone.
Yeah. It's I think that whole debate, as found in the correspondence, illustrates two poles, because Neumann, there is this passage that I really like, where Neumann criticizes Jung for his esoteric position by saying, okay, yes, by going self-help, we may lose something of the complexity and so on, but still people are hunger for meaning and orientation. We cannot leave them starving. And he says, if you do so, if you leave them starving, then they will turn to the existing bread, even of the cheapest quality. And so he was really concerned with this idea. And so we have this self-help, let's say, more position, but that I sympathize with. And then the esoteric position that says, no, there will be an antiodromia, there will be problems, that I also see the reasoning behind. So I think this is a conflict that we have within analytical psychology and that we find elsewhere. If we think about Hillman and Giegerich, that's the same pair. So Hillman, also a popularizer, someone who tried to bring Jungian ideas to the people, let's say, but in doing so, sometimes he squashed Jungian psychology, or at least that's the criticism that Giegerich makes when he says, okay, we should have, I don't know, ecology and soul making and not the technical modern, or we should have polytheism and not monotheism. And then there is this passage that I found very illuminating in Giegerich, that is in his book The Soul's Logical Life, where he criticizes Hillman and he says, but also the destruction of the Amazonian forest is the activity of the soul. If you want the soul, you need to have also, you cannot take what you want, take the best and leave the rest. So we take the Greek gods, the soul making, and then the destruction of the Amazonian forest is something else. He and Giegerich had this Hegelian outlook where he really tries to think the whole. And I thought it was brilliant, this way of putting it. But it's the same position then, because then Giegerich becomes the esoteric one who allows no people to go outside of the temple, as it were. And then Hillman becomes the one who tries to mediate for the people outside of the temple.
Maybe the last question for myself. And one of the last slides, you said neo-Jungian perspective, or the neo-Jungian perspective, we can tell a priori what projects are going to last by looking at the shape of the proposition that guides them. Can you say something about that?
So about the neo-Jungian perspective, which is also in the title, it's not something that I mean, I just took it from Stefano, who proposed it. But what I take it to mean is simply a perspective in which I rely heavily on Jung, so the collected works, the original text, but then I integrate that with other disciplines. In my case, that's philosophy, and that's moral philosophy. But I know that Stefano does it with sociology, so he puts Beck or Bauman in dialogue with Jung. I work with, I like very much Aristotelian ethics or Hegel. And so for me, neo-Jungian means just, which is also going to fill some holes that exist in Jung. Like when it comes to ethics, Jung did not have a solid understanding of what we mean by ethics. He confused ethics with morality, and therefore he rejected it. While ethics, in its more general sense, as we said, is just orientation. And so he could have framed certain ideas in more explicitly in ethical terms. And so that's just what I mean by it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you again very, very much from everybody. And that was really a nice talk, Niccolo. And thanks a lot. And goodbye, everybody. We see you at the 14th of June.
Great talk.
Bye-bye.